There are moments in life when the air stills, not from peace, but from the gathering storm of a truth too sharp to swallow. Mine came wrapped in the scent of vanilla and jasmine, the same scent my best friend, Camille, always wore. It clung to him one night, faint but undeniable, like perfume brushed against skin that wasn't mine. I am Julia Monroe, 31, producer by trade, and until recently, the loyal girlfriend of a man named Ethan. We had been together 3 years, a number I now look at with the same disbelief reserved for expired milk. It had been 3 years of whispered promises, quiet Sundays, and a slow dance toward a life I thought we were building together. And Camille, God, Camille. We were friends since we were 12. She had a way of making people feel chosen. When we were girls, she taught me how to braid my hair with ribbons. When we were older, she taught me how to bury my dreams beneath a smile. They say betrayal never comes from your enemies. I didn't know what that meant until the day I opened Ethan's laptop to order us takeout and saw a string of messages from Camille. The intimacy wasn't overt, not at first. But intimacy wears many faces. Pet names. Late-night confessions. A photo, her in his shirt, no caption needed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood up and walked to the mirror. I studied my reflection like it belonged to someone else, someone naive. And then I smiled. Let them think I was broken. Let them believe I would rage or beg. Instead, I crafted something better. Something unforgettable. My job at WPR Studios came with privileges. Among them, a producer's cut into casting calls and live segments. One show in development, Second Glance, was a playful dating experiment. 3 singles would be set up on blind dates, with the twist being that the audience would vote for who they believed deserved a real shot at love. The winner would walk away with a trip, a prize, and often a very public love interest. I made a call. I pitched myself as a contestant, framing it as an insider's take, something authentic. The producers loved the angle. Next, I submitted Camille and Ethan's names as part of the contestant pool. I faked the forms. A few strategic email addresses. All under the guise of scouting for talent. I knew their types, their quirks. Knew how to make them look like perfect strangers to each other. They never knew. The day of the taping arrived, cloaked in the kind of irony that only the betrayed understand. I wore red, a color I'd avoided for years because Ethan said it was too loud. My heart didn't pound. It drummed like a war beat. I took my seat on stage, the lights warming my face, and waited. When Camille stepped onto the stage, her eyes flicked to mine. For a moment, she froze. But professionalism, like lies, can be worn with enough rehearsal. She smiled. And then Ethan entered. He was looking at the floor, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve, unaware. When he finally looked up and saw us both, the expression that crossed his face was worth every sleepless night. Shock. Then panic. Then understanding. The audience was already laughing, confused and amused by the coincidence. The host made a joke, "Looks like we've got a reunion," not knowing the gravity of what he'd stumbled into. I stayed calm. I played the game. We all answered questions. We laughed. I shared anecdotes, carefully edited for maximum relatability. I talked about loyalty, about betrayal, about the price of self-worth. The audience leaned in. When the voting opened, it was swift. They didn't just vote for me, they championed me. The host announced me as the winner. The camera zoomed in on my smile, one I hadn't faked in months. Camille looked like she wanted to vanish. Ethan just looked tired. Like all liars do when the truth arrives dressed for television. But I didn't win because I got revenge. I won because I chose myself. And in that moment, under studio lights and scattered applause, I understood something profound. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes, it's strategy. After the cameras stopped rolling, I didn't move. People think revenge looks like shouting, storming out, or slapping someone across the face. But sometimes, It looks like a woman sitting in perfect stillness while the world scrambles to catch up with the truth she already knew. The audience began to file out, murmurs buzzing like summer flies. The producers were ecstatic. Unexpected tension. Raw emotion, they called it. I smiled and nodded, my role complete for now. Ethan stood across the stage, shifting from foot to foot, his mouth opening and closing like he might say something. Camille had already fled backstage. I didn't go after either of them. Instead, I walked down the corridor of the studio, my heels clicking with purpose. Every step was a rejection of the story they wrote without my consent. I wasn't the jilted lover. I was the architect of their exposure. That night, I went home and opened a bottle of wine I had been saving not for a special occasion, but for a declaration. I toasted to myself. To the woman who didn't beg. To the woman who chose a public arena not to humiliate, but to illuminate. In the days that followed, the clip went viral. Someone on the audience team had uploaded a segment with the caption, "When the blind date isn't so blind." Views soared. Comments poured in. She played chess while they played checkers. Queen energy. Tell me she walked off into a better life. And I did. Slowly, quietly. Camille sent a text 2 days later. "Can we talk?" I didn't reply. Let her sit in the silence she carved for me with her lies. Ethan emailed. Subject: I'm sorry. Message: I know you probably hate me, but if there's any way I can explain. I didn't hate him. I had something worse. I had indifference. What they never understood, what so many never do, is that I wasn't looking for revenge because of what I lost. I orchestrated that moment because I finally recognized my worth. And that recognition? It demanded a stage, a spotlight, a moment where I was the headline. Weeks passed. I started receiving invitations to podcasts, empowerment panels, even a guest spot on a morning talk show. People wanted to hear my story. Not because it was about betrayal, but because it was about reclaiming narrative. But here's what they didn't see. The quiet evenings where grief curled up next to me like an unwanted guest. Where I stared at my ceiling wondering how long I had ignored the signs. The way Ethan started locking his phone. The excuses. The way Camille's hugs started to feel rehearsed. I replayed every scene in my mind, not to torture myself, but to study. Like an archaeologist sifting through ruins, trying to understand what had once stood. And then I began to write. A blog, at first. Anonymous. A place where I poured every piece of my experience. The betrayal. The plan. The taping. The aftermath. And women wrote back. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. Sharing stories of betrayal, of silence, of their own red dresses and final smiles. It became more than a story. It became a movement. We are not the brokenhearted. We are the architects of our own redemption. I once believed that silence was the absence of noise. But after the blind date aired, and the world cheered for the woman who turned betrayal into spectacle, I learned that silence has tones. There's the heavy hush of isolation, the brittle quiet of shock, and then there's the silence between echoes, where your soul whispers, "Now what?" The day after the segment aired, I turned off all notifications. Not because I didn't want to read the praise, I did. I soaked in every message that called me brave, every voice that said you gave me courage. But I needed a day to let it all settle. The applause is only part of the story. The harder part is who you are when the clapping fades. I made tea, not coffee. I didn't want something that jolted me. I wanted something warm, something still. I wrapped myself in the oversized cardigan Ethan once said made me look a little too casual. It was soft. I wore it all day. Camille never followed up after that first message. She'd always been the kind of person who mistook absence for punishment. As if disappearing made things even. She didn't understand that some silences weren't anger, they were boundaries. But Ethan? Ethan persisted. He sent flowers. A ridiculous bouquet of peonies and lilies and some exotic bloom he probably thought meant I remember what you like. He didn't know. Peonies were my mother's favorite. I only kept them around out of nostalgia. My favorite was lavender. Simple, subtle, unassuming, but impossible to forget once you inhaled it. Along with the flowers came a card. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. Can we talk? I almost laughed. Didn't mean for any of it to happen is what people say when they treat intimacy like an accident. Like slipping on a wet floor, rather than undressing with intention. I tossed the flowers, kept the vase. It was a good one, thick glass, curved in all the right places. That week, the producers from the show reached out again. We'd love to do a follow-up, they said. The audience wants closure. Where are they now? They wanted to know if I'd confront Ethan on screen. Or Camille. Or both. I declined. Not because I was afraid, but because I had already won. The world had seen me. I didn't need a sequel where I explained myself. Let the world wonder. Let them fill in the blanks with assumptions. I was busy building something new. The blog had taken on a life of its own. Women wrote in, asking for advice, sharing confessions. I created a weekly column, **the red chair, **, where readers submitted stories, and I offered thoughts, not as an expert, but as a woman who'd stood in the storm and learned to dance in it. A journalist reached out. Your story is electric. Can we profile you? I hesitated. My name was already out there, thanks to the credits on the show. But going public on this level? That meant giving up the last bit of anonymity I'd been clinging to. Still, I said yes. Because here's what I was learning. Sometimes your greatest pain is your invitation to lead others out of theirs. The article was titled, Betrayed, Brilliant, and Unbreakable, The Rise of Julia Monroe. A bit dramatic, maybe, but it captured attention. The journalist had been kind, even reverent. She sat across from me in a quiet cafe, a notepad in hand, asking careful questions. Her voice was soft, like someone approaching a wounded animal. I appreciated that. But I wasn't wounded, not anymore. Still, reading the piece in print felt strange. To see my name beside phrases like empowerment icon and digital revolution felt like wearing a dress tailored for someone else. I wasn't a symbol. I was a woman who loved deeply and was betrayed more deeply still. But then I looked in the mirror. Not the one above my sink or in the hallway where Ethan once used to pause and fix his tie. I looked into the mirror, the one we all have inside us. The one that reflects not what we look like, but who we are when no one's watching. And she was different now. Not harder, exactly. Just clearer. Like the water had been stirred and finally settled. She wore her scars like silver threads in her tapestry. Not shame. Not weakness. Just proof that she survived. After the article published, my inbox exploded. Not just with interview requests or brand deals, though those came too. No, what moved me were the letters. The confessions. I watched your episode with tears in my eyes. You reminded me I wasn't crazy. My best friend slept with my husband. I thought I was broken. Then I found you. You didn't just get even. You got free. Some wrote from hospital beds. Some from shelters. Some from luxury condos where betrayal wore cufflinks and cologne. They all had different accents, different names, but the same ache. And I read everyone. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. There was one message, though, that stood out not for its pain, but for its brevity. You always had it in you. I just hope now you see it too. Aunt Renee. My mother's younger sister. The black sheep of our family. The one who once left a husband after he cheated, while the rest of the family clucked their tongues and whispered about her drama. She'd moved to Santa Fe to paint landscapes and live alone with 2 rescue dogs. I hadn't heard from her in years. I replied simply, I do see it now. Thank you. Later that week, I went back to the studio, not for another taping, but to return the red dress. The wardrobe manager had let me borrow it, a favor she rarely offered. I could have kept it, but something about returning the dress rested on the padded hanger like a relic, red satin off-shoulder, the kind that demands attention without asking for it. I smoothed the fabric one last time before zipping the garment bag and heading to the studio. The air inside the building felt different now. I used to walk these halls with the quiet confidence of someone who preferred the shadows. Not because I lacked worth, but because I thought being modest made me good. That being unassuming made me lovable. But walking in now, I held my head differently. Not like a queen, just like a woman who knew the weight of her own crown. Tina, the wardrobe manager, met me at the entrance to her domain. She looked surprised. "You're returning it?" she asked, brushing her dreadlocks back into a bun. "It was never mine," I said. "It belonged to the moment." She took the bag without argument, but not without recognition. "That moment changed things," she said, her voice soft. "Not just for you." I nodded. "I know." She paused, then added, "We've had more applicants than ever since that episode aired. But you know what's different? They're not just looking for love. They're looking for clarity, for closure, for themselves." I smiled. The kind of smile that reaches back into your chest and warms something long dormant. Then it was worth it. Leaving the studio felt like walking out of a chapter, pages fluttering behind me. I didn't look back. That evening, I lit candles, not for ambience, but for ritual. There's something sacred in marking transitions, even if only to yourself. I made tea. Lavender this time. My favorite. And I sat down to write. Not a blog post. Not a response. But a letter. To someone I never thought I'd address again. "Dear Camille, you don't owe me an explanation. And I won't give you a speech. You and I both know what happened. I trusted you. And you traded that trust for attention. For thrill. Maybe for love. I don't know. What I do know is this: I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I do. I don't want to carry the weight of what you did a day longer than I have to. I'm setting it down here. In these words. In this envelope. You'll never have access to my life again, not because I hate you, but because I love myself more. Goodbye, Julia." I didn't send it. Some letters are meant to be written, not mailed. I folded it carefully, slid it into a blue envelope, and tucked it between the pages of my journal. Later, I booked a flight. Santa Fe. I hadn't seen Aunt Renee in nearly a decade, but something about her message kept echoing through me. She had lived through her own reckoning and come out free. Maybe I needed to stand in the same sun, breathe the same high desert air, and feel what survival looked like when it stopped apologizing. I landed in Santa Fe just after noon, the kind of arrival that feels like slipping into another life. The air was thinner, scented with sage and dust, and the sun cast everything in hues of gold and amber. There's a stillness to the desert that speaks louder than any city's roar. Aunt Renee met me outside the adobe house she'd built herself. She looked the same, though time had etched wisdom into the corners of her eyes. She didn't say much, just opened her arms and held me, the way no one had in a long time, without asking, without needing, without fixing. "You look lighter," she murmured. I didn't respond right away. I was still deciding what weight I'd left behind. Inside, her home was everything Ethan's had never been. Books stacked on low tables. Canvases leaning against walls, half-painted or freshly dried. A kettle whistled in the kitchen, and 2 old rescue dogs wagged their tails in lazy welcome. We sat on her back porch that evening, mugs in hand, watching the desert surrender to twilight. "I watched the episode," Renee said quietly. I cheered. I laughed, an honest, belly-deep laugh I hadn't felt in weeks. "Did you know?" I asked. "Did you see it before I did?" "I saw the same thing in you that I saw in myself when I left," she said. "That slow death women die when they're taught to swallow instead of speak." I nodded. It didn't feel like strength at first. It felt like rage. "Rage is holy," she replied. "It burns down what no longer serves us." We talked until the stars came out, tiny diamonds sewn into indigo sky. And for the first time, I admitted it, not to the world, but to myself. I loved him. I know. And I loved her too. Not romantically, obviously. But deeply. She was my person. my if I go missing contact. And now? I stared at the horizon, the shape of the mountains in silhouette. Now I think I love myself more. Renee reached over and squeezed my hand. That's the whole journey, Julia. That's it. The next few days passed like water over smooth stones. We painted. We cooked. We walked. I breathed without apology. I cried once, watching an old film with a sister storyline too close to home, but Renee just passed me a tissue and didn't fill the silence. I journaled every morning on the porch. The words came easier here. The pain less sharp, more instructive. I realized I wasn't writing about betrayal anymore. I was writing about becoming. On the last day, Renee handed me a canvas. It was a portrait not of me, but of the woman I was becoming. Her eyes were clear, her mouth unafraid. Her dress was red. I started it the night of the show, she said. Finished it yesterday. I couldn't speak. Just hugged her tight, knowing some gifts aren't meant to be explained. As I boarded my return flight, I wasn't heading home. I was heading forward. Coming back to the city was like stepping back into a version of myself I no longer wore. The noise, the pace, the way everyone moved as if chased, it no longer fit. My apartment, once a haven, now felt cramped. Or maybe it was just that I had expanded. I placed Aunt Renee's painting in the center of my living room wall. Not tucked away, not hidden. I lit a candle beneath it and let the silence of that act speak the words I couldn't. This is who I am now. And I will not shrink to fit the life I had before. The blog, The Red Chair, had grown into a quiet phenomenon. What began as reflections and responses had become something larger. A movement, some said. A digital salon of women reclaiming their stories. Then came the offer. A publisher. A real one. We believe your story could reach people who don't even know yet they need it, the email read. We'd like to offer you a book deal. I read the message 3 times before believing it was real. Me, Julia Monroe, former shadow dweller, perennial second choice, writing a book. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked. No destination. Just blocks of city space, remembering how often I'd walked here hand in hand with Ethan, sharing dreams he'd never believed in. I passed the cafe where Camille and I once shared secrets over scones. Places hold ghosts, I realized. But ghosts only have power if we invite them in. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took myself out to dinner. Alone. I dressed up, not for attention, but because silk against my skin reminded me I deserved softness. I ordered wine, the good kind. I didn't check my phone once. And when the waiter asked if I was waiting for someone, I smiled and said no. Just celebrating. After dessert, I walked home in the early spring chill and I knew what I had to do. I said yes to the book. The first word I wrote for the book wasn't betrayal. It was beginning. Because that's what it felt like. This next chapter of my life, unfolding not with drama, but with deliberation. No longer a reaction, but a creation. The publisher paired me with an editor named Celine, a woman with a voice like velvet and the instincts of a surgeon. We're not just writing a revenge story, she said in our first call. We're writing a reckoning. I loved her instantly. We worked remotely at first, exchanging drafts, notes, voice memos at midnight when inspiration hit. I poured everything onto the page, my past with Ethan, my friendship with Camille, my silent years of self-abandonment, and the sudden, stunning rise into visibility. But also, the quiet nights, the long healing, the redefinition of love. Writing became both therapy and revolution. There were days I wept at the keyboard, not because I missed them, but because I mourned the girl who didn't know she deserved more. Halfway through the first draft, something unexpected happened. A message arrived. Not from Camille. Not from Ethan. From someone else entirely. Subject: You don't know me, but I know your story. Hi, Julia. My name is Lila. I was watching the show that night with my mother. She was in a relationship like yours, years of devotion, invisibility, and silence. After your episode, she packed a bag and left. She's staying with me now. Safe. Smiling. Thank you. I read the message again and again, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from awe. That I, a woman whose pain once lived quietly between journal pages, could become someone else's turning point. That night, I walked to the edge of the river. Not for answers. Just for air. For space to breathe into this new version of myself. And as the wind wrapped around me, I whispered aloud. I am no longer the story they wrote about me. I am the author now. By the time the book's final chapter was written, I wasn't the same woman who had first sat down at the keyboard. The Julia who began that manuscript had something to prove. The Julia who finished it had already done so, without needing the world's applause to validate it. Celine called as we wrapped the final draft. You know, she said, there's a rare kind of beauty in someone who doesn't just survive. You alchemized your pain. Alchemized. Turned lead into gold. Yes, that's what this had been all along, a transformation not of circumstances, but of self. The publisher arranged for a spring launch. They titled it The Red Chair, How Betrayal Became My Stage. I'd wanted something simpler, something quieter. But Celine reminded me, it's not about modesty anymore. It's about reach. Pre-orders climbed. Media requests surged. Suddenly, I was being asked to speak not just on podcasts or women's panels, but at universities, conferences. One day I opened my inbox and found an invitation to deliver a TEDx talk. My first instinct was fear. What if I stuttered? What if I faltered? What if they didn't see me the way they saw me on that show? But then I remembered the studio lights. The way I had sat in silence, poised and unshaken as the truth burned the room down around us. I had already done the hardest part, so I said yes. The talk was titled, Becoming the Author, How I Wrote Myself Out of Betrayal. The stage was smaller than I expected. No cameras. No audience primed to cheer. Just raw faces, some tearful, some unreadable. I told them everything. Not just the glamorous unraveling on national TV, but the slow unspooling that came after. The nights I questioned my worth. The days I wanted to disappear. The years I spent convincing myself I was safest when I stayed small. And I ended with this. You don't need a stage to reclaim your power. You just need a mirror, a moment, and the courage to say, this story belongs to me now. When I stepped off that stage, I wasn't clapping for myself. I was grieving, honoring, and finally releasing the version of me that thought love meant losing yourself. The week after the TEDx talk aired, the letters poured in, not the kind sealed in envelopes, but the kind typed through trembling fingers at midnight, sent from hospital beds, from cramped apartments, from quiet corners of lives interrupted by betrayal. Each began differently. I never thought I'd leave him. I haven't spoken about this in 10 years. Your story made me remember who I used to be. But they all shared the same ending. Thank you for speaking when I couldn't. I printed each one. Not to display them, but to honor them. I kept them in a pale blue box lined with velvet, soft to the touch. I called it my truth drawer. Every time I doubted myself, I reached in and read a handful. It grounded me, reminded me that healing is not just an echo, it's a chorus. Some nights, I wrote back. Not always directly. Some letters came with no return address, no name. But I wrote anyway. Words like balm. Letters I addressed to no one and everyone. You're not too late. Your value was never measured by their love. Leaving doesn't make you weak. Staying silent does. These became posts. Then columns. Then workshops. Women showed up, online and in person, to share, to scream, to cry, to rise. We gathered in rooms filled with folding chairs and flickering candles, sharing truths that once would have gotten us labeled dramatic, bitter, unstable. Now, we were called brave. One night, after a particularly moving session, a woman in her 60s approached me. Her name was Janine. Soft eyes. Steady hands. She said, I stayed with my husband for 30 years. Knew about the affairs. Pretended not to. Thought my silence was strength. But tonight, I told my daughter the truth. And that was for me. I hugged her. Not out of pity, but out of reverence. I was no longer a woman reclaiming her own voice. I had become a tuning fork for others to find theirs. The book tour began that spring. Cities and stages, hotel rooms and book signings. Hands held, tears shared, and always someone waiting at the end of the line to whisper, "I thought I was alone." And always I'd say back, "You never were." In every city I visited on the book tour, I waited for them. Not the fans, not the readers. Them. The ones who'd known me before the red dress. Before the show. Before I became someone whose name filled headlines and hashtags. The ones who had watched me disappear in real time and said nothing. Old friends. Colleagues. Relatives who called Camille their other niece. I waited, not because I wanted apologies, but because part of me needed to see who would show up. And some did. In Seattle, a woman waited at the back of the line during the signing. Brown curls tucked behind her ears. Nervous fingers clutched a worn copy of the book. "Julia," she whispered. "It's Elise. From college. We were roommates. For a year." I remembered. She used to borrow my sweaters and forget to return them. She also dated a boy I liked once, swearing she didn't know. Maybe she hadn't. "You were always the quiet one," she said, her voice quivering. I didn't know back then how much silence costs. "I read your book. I'm sorry I didn't see you." I didn't offer her forgiveness. I didn't need to, but I smiled gently. We all see more when we've been broken open. Others came too. A former coworker who once gossiped about my promotion. A cousin who once laughed when Camille teased me. They arrived not to grovel, but to acknowledge. I let them. Not because I needed their closure, but because they did. One night, after a signing in Chicago, my phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. From unknown. Subject, "Congratulations. I watched your TED Talk. I've seen the press. I guess you got the last word. E." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Ethan. It had to be. No apology. No accountability. Just a recognition of my victory, as if it were a game. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because he still didn't understand. This was never about getting the last word. It was about finally speaking the first word that was mine. It was a Sunday in June when I got the letter. A real one this time, pen to paper, tucked into a pale pink envelope with no return address. But I knew the handwriting. Sharp, slanted, rushed in places. It was Camille's. I hadn't seen her name written out in years, but memory doesn't forget the lines that once shaped your trust. I debated opening it. Held it under warm lamplight like something fragile, maybe dangerous. But curiosity, like grief, always finds a way in. I unfolded the paper. One page. No salutation. I watched the episode. I didn't know it was possible to hurt in so many directions at once. "I hated you for not reacting the way I expected. I thought you'd confront me. Scream. Make it about your pain. But instead you took all the air out of the room with your calm, and I realized then I was never the strong one. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know, I see it now. What I cost you. What I cost myself. You always made people feel like they mattered. I wanted that light for myself. I thought if I took it from you, I'd glow too. But I didn't. I just burned. That was all. No signature. No date. I read it 3 times before folding it back into its envelope. Then I slid it into the same drawer where I kept Aunt Renee's portrait. Not out of sentimentality. Out of respect for the past and for how it finally found its voice. I didn't reply. I didn't seek her out. Her words weren't a bridge. They were a mirror. A final reflection of what we were. Of how 2 girls who once shared secrets and sleepovers had become a lesson in boundaries, betrayal, and self-redemption. And strangely, I felt nothing. Not joy. Not sadness. Just stillness. The kind that comes when the last loose thread is finally tied off, not with a knot, but with grace. Summer crept in slowly that year. The kind of season that doesn't announce itself, but rather warms the corners of your life until suddenly you realize you've stopped bracing for the cold. I spent most mornings on my balcony, feet tucked under me, sipping coffee from the mug Aunt Renee gifted me. "Speak softly, but never swallow the truth," it read. There was no tour this month. No events. No spotlights. Just quiet days filled with small, unremarkable joys. And in that quiet, I began to remember who I was before the storm. Before Ethan's smile became my compass. Before Camille's approval felt like oxygen. Before the betrayal, before the red dress, before the moment the world finally looked up and saw me. I found myself reaching for old hobbies I had long shelved. Sketching, baking, music I once dismissed as indulgent. I danced around the kitchen one night, barefoot and singing badly, and laughed so hard I had to sit on the floor to catch my breath. That's what healing looks like sometimes. Not grand speeches or dramatic breakaways. Just a woman laughing alone at 11 p.m. to a playlist she made for herself. And then, something else happened. Love knocked. Not loud. Not demanding. Just present. His name was Daniel. We met at a charity fundraiser for women's shelters, an event I attended as a speaker and he as a donor. He introduced himself with quiet confidence and didn't lead with admiration, but curiosity. "You looked calm up there," he said after my speech. "Like you weren't trying to impress anyone." I tilted my head. "I wasn't." "That's rare," he replied. "And beautiful." We talked for hours. Not about the past, not about my book or his business. We talked about favorite books, travel dreams, the comfort of rainy mornings. He didn't ask about Ethan. Or Camille. He didn't mention the show at all. He saw me, not the story. That night, as we said goodbye, he touched my elbow lightly. "I'd like to see you again. If that's something you want." No pressure. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't hear danger in the offer. I didn't hear performance. I heard possibility. And I said yes. Dating again felt like walking barefoot on stones, delicate, tentative, almost foreign. But with Daniel, there was no rush, no choreography. Just presence. The kind of quiet connection that asked for nothing except honesty. We met for coffee at first. Then walks. Then dinners where time lost meaning. He never pried, never poked at scars. He just listened. And when I chose to share, he received my truth like something sacred. One evening, we sat beneath a string of cafe lights, the kind that make the world feel smaller in the best way. He reached across the table, not for my hand, but to steady a napkin the wind had nudged toward the edge. That's how I'd come to think of him, not as someone who swept me off my feet, but as someone who studied the things the wind might carry away. After dinner, we lingered outside. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a small box from his coat pocket. My breath caught for a moment, too soon for anything serious, surely. But when I opened it, I laughed. Inside was a silver keychain with a miniature red chair charm. "You once said that moment helped you reclaim your story," he said softly. "I thought maybe now, you deserved a reminder of how far you've come." I blinked back unexpected tears. "I love it," I whispered. "It's perfect." "No," he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You're perfect. This is just a memento." Later that night, as I undressed and hung up my coat, I paused, holding the keychain in my palm. It was a symbol of where I'd been, yes, but also of where I was going. Not every chapter needs to start with heartbreak. Some begin quietly, gently, with a man who listens, with a keychain, with a woman who finally believes she deserves soft things. The first time Daniel said, "I love you," it didn't come during some orchestrated moment. It was a Tuesday. We were in line at the farmer's market. He was holding a basket of strawberries. I was debating between two types of honey, frowning in that overly serious way I do when choosing something sweet. He leaned in, his voice barely louder than a breath. "God, I love you." I froze. Not because I didn't feel it too, but because for so long I had associated love with performance. With grand gestures, twisted intentions, sharp edges softened only by apology. But this was soft to begin with. "I love you too," I said. And I meant it, in the marrow-deep way you mean things you never thought you'd say again. We walked home in silence, holding hands, the world loud around us, but our world quiet and whole. Later that night, curled up on his couch, I told him something I hadn't told anyone, not even Aunt Renee. I used to think I was only valuable when I was useful, when I made people feel better, when I stayed small so they could feel big. He kissed the top of my head. "You're valuable when you breathe." That stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I began saying no to things that once felt compulsory. No to another interview that asked me to relive the betrayal without acknowledging the healing. No to a brand that wanted to commercialize my story without honoring its soul. No to people who still couldn't see me without mentioning the woman I used to be. And every time I said no, something new said yes inside me. I started writing again, not blogs or chapters or speeches, but poetry. Unpolished, unrehearsed, poured straight from the wound and onto the page. I called them whispers. They weren't for publication. They were for me. For the part of me that had been silenced too long. One afternoon, as sunlight poured across my writing desk, I looked at myself in the mirror. No makeup. No pose. Just skin and breath and history. And I whispered, "I see you. I'm proud of you." Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do after being burned isn't rising from the ashes. It's sitting still long enough to feel the warmth of the light that finally finds you. By autumn, the book had become a quiet sensation, not a viral flame, but a slow, steady ember warming hearts one page at a time. It was nominated for a few awards, which surprised me. Not because I didn't believe in my words, but because I'd stopped needing the world to stamp them with gold stars. The real validation came in bookstores. Women lingered in the aisles, clutching the red chair, tears rimmed in pride. Librarians wrote me to say the copy never stayed on the shelf long. Therapists ordered it in bulk for their clients. My name was being spoken in places I'd never stepped. It felt strange at first, the echo of myself traveling farther than I ever dared dream. But eventually it felt right. Because my name, once forgotten, mispronounced, or drowned out, was now a ripple in still water. And then came the gala. An event hosted by a national women's collective, honoring stories that had sparked cultural shifts. My publisher encouraged me to attend, gently nudging. "It's more than a trophy, Julia. It's a moment." So I went. Not in red this time. I chose midnight blue, the color of resilience, of sky before dawn, of strength that doesn't need to shout. The ballroom was filled with luminaries, artists, activists, writers. I expected to feel small, but instead I felt seen. When they called my name, I rose slowly, not with trembling knees, but with deliberate grace. I took the stage, the lights soft and warm, the air thick with expectation. And I said, "I used to think a woman's power came from how well she could survive pain in silence. But I was wrong. Our power is not in how quietly we endure, it's in how bravely we speak, how fiercely we live, and how tenderly we love ourselves, even when others forget how." The applause was thunderous. But I didn't cry. Not then. I cried later, backstage, when a young woman with shaking hands approached me. Her name was Hannah, barely 20. Eyes wide, voice trembling. She said, "I left my boyfriend last week. Because of your book." I finally believed I deserved more. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than any speech could explain. I hadn't just rewritten my story. I had opened the pages of someone else's. Winter came softer that year. Not because the city changed, but because I had. The cold no longer cut the same way. The wind was still sharp, but I walked differently, shoulders relaxed, chin lifted, like someone who trusted the path beneath her even when it wasn't lit. Daniel and I spent the holidays together, a quiet merging of two pasts trying to become something new. We didn't throw parties. We didn't pose for social media. We just were. Fireplace lit, music low, hands entwined over shared books and coffee mugs. He gave me a necklace that wasn't expensive but deliberate, a tiny, intricate compass. For when you forget how far you've come, he said, fastening it around my neck. It rested against my collarbone like a secret promise. I gave him a journal. Not empty, but half-filled. Pages of letters I'd written to the version of myself who once thought love meant shrinking. And on the inside cover, so you'll know all of me, especially the parts one never got to say out loud. We spent New Year's Eve watching the city lights from his rooftop. There were no grand resolutions. Just this. He asked, "What do you want from this year?" I answered, "More truth. More quiet. More joy that doesn't need to be performed." He nodded. "And love." I smiled. "Love, yes. But not the kind that drowns me. The kind that lets me float." He kissed me then, slow, certain. Not the beginning of a fairy tale, but the next page of a story that no longer needed dragons to be brave. That night, before we fell asleep, I journaled one sentence. This life, the one I built from ruins, it finally fits. And it did. Because when you've been broken wide open, the pieces don't go back the way they were. They grow new shapes, ones only you can recognize. Ones you don't need anyone else to understand. Some stories don't need conclusions, just quiet shelves to rest on. But there was one chapter one hadn't closed. Not out of fear, but because the words had never quite landed in my mouth the way I wanted them to. Until now. So I wrote a letter. Not to Ethan. Not to Camille. To the version of myself who stayed far too long. Dear Julia. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the nights you stared at a phone that wouldn't light up. For the way you twisted your worth into knots, just to be someone's afterthought. For how you wore silence like armor and called it love. You weren't stupid. You weren't weak. You were loyal, to a fault, yes, but also to your own hope. And that deserves reverence, not ridicule. I wish someone had told you earlier that love isn't supposed to feel like waiting for permission. But you know what? You found your way. You let the fire burn, and then you rebuilt with ash on your hands and clarity in your bones. You stood on a stage in a red dress and didn't flinch. You spoke when your voice trembled. You left when it would have been easier to stay. And you wrote your way back to yourself. I'm proud of you. I love you. Now go. Write new stories. Ones that don't start in pain. With grace. Me. I didn't fold the letter. I framed it. Hung it above my writing desk. Because some truths are too sacred to hide in drawers. Some truths become foundations. And on that foundation, I was finally building a life that didn't just look good. It felt like mine. By February, the noise had quieted. The articles slowed. The speaking requests grew more selective. The spotlight, once hot and heavy, dimmed to a steady glow, and I welcomed it. Because not all light is meant to blind. Some is meant to guide. It was during this softer season that I ran into someone unexpected. At the bookstore, of all places. I had just finished signing a few fresh copies of the second edition, now with a new foreword, one I'd written after meeting Hannah, the girl who left her boyfriend after reading my book. I turned a corner in the nonfiction aisle and froze. Camille. No makeup. A scarf around her neck. She looked thinner, older somehow, not in years, but in weight. Like someone carrying the invisible load of choices made too hastily. She saw me. Her eyes widened. But she didn't bolt. Instead, she stepped forward, one hand halfway raised, unsure if it should wave or fall. "Julia," she said. I nodded. "Camille." The silence stretched, once a threat, now just air. "I read your book," she said finally. "Every page." I said nothing, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to defend. "I wanted to hate you for it," she added. "But I couldn't. You told the truth." I met her gaze, steady. "Yes, I did." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. It wasn't theatrical. No tears. No grabbing of hands. Just 3 words dropped like stones into a well already dry. I didn't say I forgave her. I didn't need to. But I did offer her something she hadn't earned, yet I chose to give anyway. Peace. Take care of yourself, I said. And walked away. There was no need to look back. Because when the echoes no longer hurt, that's how you know you've truly healed. It's strange how your name can sound so different depending on who says it and how. There was a time when hearing Julia from Ethan's lips felt like a promise. Later, it felt like a punch. Camille used to say my name like it belonged to her story, an accessory, a supporting character. For years, I lived with their versions of me echoing in my head. But now my name is mine again. One evening, Daniel and I attended a small local writers' circle. No one knew me as the woman from the show. They just saw me as Julia, a fellow writer. I read a new piece, a quiet poem about healing, about the slowness of it, the honesty. Afterward, a young woman approached me with a gentle smile. "You're Julia Monroe?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't ask about the drama or the fame. She said, "My mom and I read your book together. It changed how we talk. Thank you for giving us a way to find each other again." And just like that, the weight of my name became something sacred. Not from applause. Not from recognition. But from impact. It reminded me of something Aunt Renee once told me over tea and warm cornbread in Santa Fe. When you stop letting people define you by what broke you, that's when you become whole. I was whole now. Not because life had stopped being complicated, but because I stopped letting broken things name me. My name was no longer a sigh, no longer a shadow. It was a bell. Rung clear. Held strong. Heard by the right ones. Healing teaches you many things. But one of the first lessons it gave me, wrapped in fire and silence, was this. Stop apologizing for being the storm just because others preferred you silent. I used to say sorry for everything. For taking up space. For having opinions. For crying too easily. For not laughing at jokes that cut too close to bone. I said sorry when Ethan forgot things, birthdays, events, parts of me, and made me feel like I had asked too much by remembering myself. I said sorry to Camille for outshining her, even when I dimmed my own light. I said sorry to myself, quietly, when I declined the RISD scholarship, telling my younger self, one day, they'll see it was worth it. Now I know, the only apology I ever needed to make was to the parts of me I abandoned. So I started keeping a list. Things I no longer apologize for. Saying no without explanation. Wanting to be alone. Speaking when something feels wrong. Laughing too loud. Crying during commercials. Leaving a room when the energy turns cruel. Loving myself out loud. Choosing quiet over chaos. Loving Daniel deeply and without armor. Believing in second beginnings. Being too much for the wrong people. Walking away. I framed it. Not to declare a manifesto, but to whisper a reminder. That survival isn't just about what we walk through, it's about who we become when we stop asking others for permission to be whole. Daniel read the list one night. He didn't say much. Just kissed my forehead and said, "Add one more." I looked up. "What?" He smiled. "Don't apologize for being the reason someone else finds their voice." So I added that too. The beautiful thing about healing, the part no one prepares you for, is how ordinary it becomes. In the beginning, every moment feels monumental, speaking up, walking away, choosing yourself. But then, if you're lucky and stubborn enough to keep going, those once-defined acts of survival become your daily rhythm. You build your life like laying bricks. One, then another. And suddenly you look up and realize you have walls. A home. A life that holds you without conditions. I woke one morning with the sun slicing through the blinds, Daniel's steady breathing beside me, and I smiled before my feet even hit the floor. That simple act, waking up happy, used to feel unreachable. We'd moved in together a few months before. Not because we needed to fill some empty space, but because we'd already built something solid enough to rest inside. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was ours, a mix of my quiet neutrals and his warm wood tones. A home built not from compromise, but from care. Daniel was in the kitchen when I padded in barefoot, wearing one of his oversized sweaters. He looked up from the stove, spatula in hand, and smiled, that soft, steady smile that never demanded anything from me. "Morning, beautiful," he said. "Morning," I whispered, wrapping my arms around his waist from behind. This was what love looked like now. No performance. No grand displays masking fractures. Just breakfast and soft sweaters and steady hands. Later that afternoon, while Daniel was out, I sat down at my desk, the one beneath Aunt Renee's painting. The red chair in her portrait watched me like an old friend. I opened my laptop and clicked on a folder titled simply, "Next," because the book tour was behind me, but the writing wasn't. This wasn't a story about betrayal anymore. That chapter had long closed. Now, I was writing about what comes after the reckoning. About love that didn't demand self-abandonment. About rediscovering softness after the fire. I titled the new manuscript, "After the Ashes, Choosing Joy Again." I let my fingers fly across the keyboard, words pouring out like a conversation with my past self. I wrote about quiet mornings. About standing in bookstores without flinching when people whispered my name. About love that didn't hurt. About peace that didn't apologize for being small. And I wrote about something else too, legacy. Because, slowly, my story had stopped being just mine. Women reached out daily now, not just to thank me, but to share their own next chapters. Stories of leaving, of rebuilding, of falling in love again, not just with new partners, but with themselves. One woman, Nora, had written, "You didn't save me. You showed me how to save myself." That was the legacy. Not the viral clip or the bestseller title or the speaking tours. It was the ripple effect. The quiet revolution in living rooms, in therapy offices, in whispered confessions between friends. One weekend, Daniel and I traveled to Santa Fe to visit Aunt Renee again. She hadn't changed much. Her home still smelled like eucalyptus and paint. Her dogs still padded behind her everywhere she went. As we sat on her porch sipping sweet tea, she studied me with those sharp, wise eyes. "You're softer now," she said. I smiled. "Not weaker." "No, never weaker. Just not carrying so many swords anymore." I laughed softly. "Turns out I don't need them as much these days." She reached over and squeezed my hand. That's what true strength looks like. That evening, she gifted me a second painting, one she had been working on quietly for months. It showed a path winding through a wildflower field. At the very end of the path stood a simple wooden chair. Not red this time, but lavender. My color. "It's your new chair," she said. "Your next chapter." I cried then. But not from grief. From arrival. Because that's what healing really is. Not an escape from the past, but a homecoming to yourself. As spring bloomed, so did my life. Book 2 found a publisher. The women's collective I co-founded, called The Chair Project, launched support groups and mentorship programs for women leaving toxic relationships. Aunt Renee even led art therapy workshops for some of them. Daniel proposed under a quiet stretch of stars one night, no audience, no spectacle. Just a ring, a question, and a love that had never once asked me to dim. I said yes. Not because I needed saving, but because I had already saved myself. And now, I was simply choosing joy.